I want to tell you how much I appreciate the leadership of the three of you on this issue and putting this together today. Certainly appreciate getting to hear from all the witnesses too. Thank you for bringing your expertise, your stories, and being willing to tell them so that we can save more children and keep this from happening. I have been concerned about this issue throughout my first several months as a United States Senator. I've been here 18, 19 months now. And one of my very first hearings was with Secretary Becerra. And I remember talking extensively to him and asking questions, trying to expose the flaws, the enormous inadequacies of the UAC program. And in particular, I spent most of my time expressing concern about the fact that in March 2021, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, so ORR, that we've been talking about today, issued field guidance that actually waived background check requirements for adult household members and alternate adult caregivers identified in a sponsor care plan. I couldn't wrap my head around that. As a mom, to think about what is happening to these children, to think about the fact that there were no background checks. And obviously these were Category 2 sponsors, so meaning certain relatives of a child other than a parent. I wasn't satisfied with the answers that he gave me. And obviously the more and more we learn, the more and more that I am affirmed in that feeling. And I think the more that the world sees that the operational realities of this program are disgusting and despicable. And before I get to my question, I also think it's important that we note at the end of the day, many of the problems that we are seeing with the UAC program are yet another consequence of the immigration policies of this administration and that have encouraged extremely high levels of migrants to come here in the first place. I mean, the moment that President Biden took office in the first 100 days, he issued 94 executive orders. He immediately said, we're going to halt deportations, we're going to stop construction of the border wall, and we're going to give amnesty to millions. That encourages more and more people to come here, more and more people to take that risk, and more children to be put in these vulnerable situations. And the higher the levels of the illegal immigration that we have seen, obviously, they are going to put strains on every program, every policy, every procedure that was designed to deal with individuals, including these children at our southern border. So today's roundtable is a great reminder that Congress needs to act. We must close these loopholes. We cannot continue to kick the can down the road. And when we take back control, I expect us to do something about this. And so what I want to hear from you today is the things that we should be thinking about. What should we be doing? I want to learn. I want us to know so that we can be ready to go. We can tell your story to the world and actually do something about it. Because I know many members that are sitting up here have pieces of legislation that would address some of these issues. But it's also worth noting that this hasn't always been just Republicans talking about this. If you go back to 2014, President Obama actually sent a letter to congressional leadership in June of 2014, which is over a decade ago, asking Congress to amend laws to ensure that children from non-contiguous countries are treated the same as those from Mexico. Even the editorial board of the Washington Post at that point in time did the same thing in a 2014 op-ed. So this shouldn't be controversial. This should be bipartisan, and we should do something for these children. And I want to start Ms. Rodas and Mrs. White, it is clear that even in your testimony and your answers today that we have created a culture within the administration. This administration has created a culture where they prioritize speed over safety when it comes to respect to the placement of children. Just as I talked about my questions with Secretary Becerra, it seems to me that we have a UAC program that isn't just working well, but it isn't fit for its purpose. And I think the reason the program isn't fit for its purpose has a lot to do with HHS departmental policy and management failures. If you look at section 2.5.1 of OOR's program guide for UAC's program, it lays out the background check requirements for potential sponsors of unaccompanied children. And so when you look at all of these things and you take a look at it, based on your experience, do you agree with me that HHS should revisit some of these policies and require FBI fingerprinting and criminal history background checks? You mentioned, obviously, even if we were to run a criminal background check here, it's talking about what is happening in the country of origin and obviously being able to bring those things together. But for all UAC sponsors and adult household members of the place that they will be ultimately placed, do you think that that's important? And I mean, for me personally, I think that's just common sense, but I'd love your thoughts on that, having been on the ground and seeing it firsthand.
Yeah, so what I can comment first is obviously that the policies that you talked about worked, right? And that's indicative because less than 3% of the children that we saw on the site were Mexican. The vast majority of the children, almost 70%, were Guatemalan, right? So that's indicative there that policy does work. And as far as vetting requirements and background checks, to be quite honest, they don't work. Again, because we're not looking at the records, from in country. We're looking at if they've committed a crime here in the U.S. Very typically, these sponsors have just recently themselves come here because, again, we're talking about undocumented persons here in the country that are serving as these sponsors. Really, the only way to combat this, and this is really just a very base level thing that we can do, is to require DNA testing. If this is a family reunification program, then at a minimum, you need to have those rapid DNA tests that can very quickly prove that there's some sort of familial relationship.
And Senator Marsha Blackburn has been all over that in all of the right ways. So
Yes.
Absolutely. And do you have anything to add?
Sure.
Mrs. Rodas?
Thank you, Senator. So what's interesting is the program is touted as a family reunification program, but that's not what's happening anymore, right? Less than 40% of the children are going to their parents. That's not what's happening. The system is being used. And what's stunning to me is that we have a program called humanitarian parole, which is to be the sponsor of an adult, and the requirements for that are much more stringent than the requirements to sponsor a child. So that doesn't really make sense. So we have higher requirements of the sponsor of an adult through humanitarian parole than we do for the sponsorship of a child. And that doesn't really make any sense. At a baseline, it should be at least the requirements of humanitarian
Absolutely.
parole. But I would question, why would the United States government have any policy that separates children from their families in their home country? I don't think we should have this program in this manner.
Absolutely. In a well-known February 2023 New York Times piece about the labor exploitation of UACs, there was a video clip of the secretary comparing HHS's handling and discharge of unaccompanied kids to sponsors as a, quote, assembly line. He appeared to express frustration that children weren't being released fast enough and stated that, quote, this is not the way you do an assembly line. Mrs. White, you testified that over 300 children had gone to just 2 homes and locations. Mrs. Rodas, you said, obviously speed over safety. This goes directly to this. What are some of the ways that you all think Congress could best address this? And I'll open this up to anyone that wants to answer.
So I think we've talked about this a couple times. This needs to go into the hands of law enforcement agency, not Health and Human Services. They've proved over and over again for over a decade that they are not able, they're not capable to run this kind of program and deliver children safely. And again, they're not even going to family members most of the time. Those category 1s that are supposedly parents are in many cases not the parents because they're fraudulent documents. Again, you're getting a birth certificate for a child that has no photo on it. You don't know if it's actually their birth certificate. Most of these were fresh documents as if they had just been printed, the day before, right? And secondly, the parent, the supposed parent that's providing the identification, you never see them face to face. Again, this is a mechanism that we used WhatsApp to receive documents, which in some cases were copies of copies.
And Dr. Sadolski, I know that you've done like a number of just obviously research in this field, and in my remaining like literal second, do you have anything in particular that you want to add as it relates to aspects of the program and the placement and the process that you think Congress needs to address? I know that you've been obviously zeroed in on bad actors and transnational criminal organizations, and I would just love to get your take on this as well.
Sure, and I certainly agree with Ms. White. It really needs to be a law enforcement issue. So the cartels are providing a lot of false documentation. That's something that is going to be completely overlooked by ORR. So the answer, I believe, part of the answer is to really have that law enforcement involvement versus there being a separation between ORR and law enforcement. ORR is hesitant to share information with law enforcement because they're in fear that either the child or the sponsor themselves are going to get deported, but that's not the case. And so that, in part, is what's part of our broken system.
Thank you all so much. It is despicable we're allowing this to happen in the United States of America.